Let's switch gears now from examining the path of the war to taking a broader view of the war as a experience in modern technology for those who are fighting it. Not only those who are fighting it, but also the generals who are involved, the military planners, and also civilians. Because one of the biggest impacts of the war, perhaps the most lasting and most devastating impact of the war, is the realization that the technologies that are going into the war, those that were originally designed for peaceful purposes, as well as those that were designed for military purposes, have not only transformed how war is conducted, but they're really transforming the essential relations between people and how people envision the future. And I think there's few things that embody this more than the airplane, which brings great promise for transportation and the mastery of the skies and all of the utopian ideas that come along with the mastery of flight by humans. Because remember, this is the first war in which planes are used to this great degree. And but also that the that these utopian ideas quickly become quickly become dreams of devastation and dreams of horror in the midst of the war. The same can be said of telephones, which have this amazing potential to unite people across continents and uh, being able to have a disembodied voice that you can listen to over the phone, a loved one from who previously you could really not communicate except by letter. Now you can actually experience them. These great promises before the war, many of which were seen as sort of the pinnacle achievements of what we often call European civilization, in the war become instruments of death and destruction and horror. And that shift is perhaps the shift that, for Europeans in particular, proves the most difficult to comprehend and cope with psychologically, and would have really lasting effects all into the rest of the 20th century and beyond. This is a war in which technology and its power in military uses really comes home to the European populace. There's a way to look at this in that, in fact, that the United States, through the US Civil War, actually experienced something of this in a totalistic effect on the North American continent between 1861 and 1865. Now, the technologies by 1914 are much more advanced. There's no planes in the Civil War, but the beginnings of some of the instruments of mass death, like machine guns and high explosives, being used in a relatively contained area in which civilians are experiencing these effects, that's something that really takes place to a large extent in the U.S. Civil War. This might be said, it is to be said to be the first time that the European continent experiences the totality of war, and experiences it in a much more devastating way than the U.S. Civil War. But so let's talk about some of these technologies which arrive in the years of World War One. One thing that is perhaps the most totalizing idea of how the war gets fought is through the example of trench warfare. We've all heard of trench warfare. We might not know exactly what it is, but the trench warfare is basically a way in which armies are driven underground by the power of the firepower that is being employed on both sides. In previous wars, firepower trenches were dug. Don't get me wrong. There was trench battle in Virginia during the U.S. Civil War for a long period of time. So there was some form of trench battle because of the high explosives that were used in the U.S. Civil War. But the line of trenches that extends for hundreds of miles from the coast of France and Belgium and all through France and Belgium for hundreds of miles south, this line of trenches has really no parallel before in human history. And none of the military planners really foresaw this defining characteristic of World War One. They never really anticipated that the stalemate would continue for so many years, and that most of the deaths and disease and horror would extend along this trench line in which neither side would be able to make any headway and would just constantly be throwing young men into this battle zone. So the enormous firepower drives armies underground, and living underground is terrible. It's you're exposed to standing water and all the diseases that brings, the vermin and all the diseases that they bring, all of the various ailments, and most of the life of a World War One soldier on this trench line is spent really below the surface of the earth until they are sort of called to go over the top and go and attack the other line, in which case many of them are mowed down by advanced machine guns. Many of them, while they're in the trenches, are bombed by artillery strikes. Artillery can be lobbed from miles away now, so the only warning you have is the whistling of the shell as you hear it overhead, and you want to hear it because one of the things about hearing it means that one of the things is that you think it probably won't hit you if you're hearing it. Well, in any case, this enormous firepower drives armies underground, and this is a totally new thing in certainly in European warfare, and certainly to the scale that it extended throughout most of Europe is something new on Earth. The other part of this is that not only do you have all of this artillery on both sides, which is driving armies underground, but that artillery can be replicated quite quickly now with the modern industrial factory system that is present on both sides of that trench line. So in Germany, which had industrialized very rapidly in the late 19th century, they're able to churn out artillery shells and cannons and tanks at a rate that was never been possible before in human history. So the resupplying of the lines with this machinery, with this military machinery, is possible at a rate that would have created a whole different strategy in previous times. Because in previous times, you would have had a shortage of artillery, you would have had a shortage of bullets, you would have had a shortage of many of these supplies. And when you don't have those type of shortages, you can just bombard the other side with the material that you're making at this steady clip. And in this, you can see the diminution of humanity, the flesh of humanity, in the wake of this monstrous amount of firepower and explosive technology and metals. And this becomes one of the smallness, for instance, that a factory worker might feel in the late 19th century in relation to the machines that they are manning can be compared to the smallness of the soldier in underground waiting for a massive tank or a huge artillery shell or a machine gun to be the deliverer to them of death. And I think this is another defining characteristic of the war in terms of the smallness that soldiers feel in the wake of technology and the rapidity with which those technologies are reproduced and threaten soldiers' lives. Remember, both sides have this. Both sides are heavily industrialized at this point, beginning in 1914. And neither side anticipated this ability to constantly supply and that there being a stalemate. So each side just throwing artillery and weaponry at each other constantly over the course of 5 years. And a corollary to that, and this goes into the way that this affects societies, is that since artillery can be fired from miles away, that although most of the soldiers are arrayed along this trench, along this front, both in the west and the east, that those are just the soldiers. Those, their commanders, the higher ups, the officers, the generals, they are very far away from the front, or not so much say very far away. They're at a protective distance. Those who are launching the artillery can be far away from the trench line, so they can be somewhat inured to the effects of what they are doing. They can lob this artillery from miles away and not really see its effect. And you can see a corollary today in the use of drones, for instance, which can be used from thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. Someone can be sitting in a military command center in, say, South Carolina, and be firing using a military drone somewhere in Afghanistan. So that begins, that distance from death is something which begins really, it doesn't totally begin in World War I. I mean, again, you had it in previous wars where you had artillery, but now the artillery power can go farther and faster, and it's more deadly. What that does is not only does that disconnect certain employers of that technology behind the lines, both the officers and the artillery experts who are manning those, but it creates a separation between those who are on the front lines, who are dying in droves, and those who are relatively protected behind the lines. There is a class difference there. There is an expectation of death difference there. And this drives in all armies in World War I a certain amount of I'm looking for the word. It drives a certain amount of resentment between the officer class and those who are on the front lines. Those who are on the front lines feel an increasing awareness of their expendability, an increasing resentment at the fact that the officers who command them do not. And remember also, in an army like, say, the British Army, the officer class is usually plucked from those who are of the elite of society. Those are the ones who have connections. Those are the ones who certainly are likely are wealthier and can, in some cases, expect a commission into an officer corps. So that resentment is exacerbated in this life or death situation in which your wealth determines your ability to survive the conflict. This, over the course of the war, creates a profound disillusionment among many in battle, and both the officer corps and in those on the front lines, in the infantry, of alienation from their own society, alienation from the causes of the war, because after 5 years, the entire affair is beginning to seem like a farce, like an absolutely revolting farce. And it also engenders a sense of meaninglessness among many of the soldiers, and certainly there's a huge amount of numbing that's going on as this is proceeding, but it's creating a disconnect between the human goals of a war and the human cost of the war. So you're having soldiers on both sides feel like their lives are not worth anything in this conflict, both from the rate of death and the expendability they might feel and the cheapness of death, but also through their diminutive feelings in relation to the technologies that are being used. So both the machinery that has arisen, that is taking their lives, seems like some, almost to an extent, a disembodied machine world that is in some way responsible for their death. There's something very inhuman about World War I. both in the cheapness of human life and the coming power of machines. There's generally very little hand-to-hand combat in World War One, and there's a real gap between the goals of the conflict, the prosecution of the conflict, and how soldiers feel about what they're doing. Some of the, not all of the horrors of the Great War are going to be military technologies. Perhaps the most enduring way in which the globe and most peoples, because remember, most peoples are not on the front lines, most people are not fighting on Earth, but most people on Earth at this point in the 19 teens have access to newspapers, and newspapers over the course of the 19th century, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, are able to reproduce pretty good photographs of what's going on anywhere in the world. And newspapers increasingly became more and more dependent on photographs. Really, after the mid-19th century, you start to see a proliferation of photographs in newspapers. This photography is on a daily basis bringing home the carnage of the war. Again, if you go back to the U.S. Civil War, the photographs of Matthew Brady, who was a Civil War photographer, really brought home to people who were not on the front the true horrors of war in general. And remember, this is an epochal shift in how humans experience war, because in the past, most people experienced war through stories, glorified stories, which were filtered through not only propaganda networks, but also through the lens of just being distant from it and wanting to valorize the war from a distance, and believe that it was being fought for a good cause, and believing that people died beautiful deaths. This is not the case in World War I. It's undeniable that the photographs that are coming back of dismembered bodies and young men no older than 18 or 19 or younger, lying gray in puddles of mud and filth, these are the photos that are coming back. And that's the true nature of war. So this is really certainly the first global war in which the scale and revolting nature of death with these technologies is something that everyone can see. So this is a horror that the entire world is waking up to. This is a horror that humanity, in a sense, is realizing. And no place that receives a newspaper, much less books and magazines and all sorts of things that come out of this, no place is immune from this perspective. The other aspect of this war is that it's sometimes called the first total war, although again, this can go to the U.S. Civil War, and again, there are other conflicts which have characteristics of this. But this is a war that affects civilians. While most of it's fought along this front, civilians are those who are sort of drawn into the conflict. They become many of the towns. It is fought in some towns. These towns are devastated, obviously. Civilians are used as targets. The terrorizing of civilians is part and parcel of the war. And on the other side, civilians are intimately connected with the creation of the war material that is being sent to the front, because remember, they're now part of this industrial system in which is creating most of this war material. So entire societies are mobilizing in entire factory systems, which before were creating goods for the creation of factories or consumer consumption, are then shifted. Their gears are shifted into creating war material. One thing that does characterize World War I is the use of atrocity propaganda, and this would actually cause some pretty down the road deleterious effects on the believability of what people are receiving in war. this is a problem that continues to the present day, but during World War I, there was a great deal of propaganda on both sides against the supposed savagery of the other side. In Great Britain, for instance, there was a very fervent effort to paint Germans, Huns as they were called, as barbaric, as almost inhuman. There's a famous account of of Germans who supposedly invaded this Belgian town and bayoneted babies, put babies on their bayonets, and sort of paraded around with them. A lot of these stories were not only exaggerated but generally untrue, but they were used to motivate the civilian populace in the course of this war that kept drawing out. So these propaganda stories became more and more necessary to be inflated in order to get the civilian population to believe in the cause of the war. The problem that this engendered and the terrible legacy that this engendered was that during World War II, when actual atrocities, for instance, were being committed by the Nazi regime in the form of the Holocaust, many people were suspect that these stories were true because in World War I, it turned out that many of these stories had been exaggerated and not true. And that is one of the problems with propaganda when it is used in the service of trying to convince a civilian population of the inherent inhumanity of your opponent, is that you run the risk of reducing any credibility you have in the future when the world is faced with a truly horrifying event such as the Holocaust. Other new technologies that come from the Great War, which I've not mentioned, but perhaps most transformative, was chemical warfare. Things like mustard gas, the use of chemical agents that are supposed to blow into the other side. Oftentimes they would blow back depending upon wind shifts, and then if it did, you better be wearing a gas mask. And in fact, one of the imaginations of being in the trenches, aside from all the terrible nature of trench life, was constantly having to wear this ridiculously hot gas mask to prevent against a mustard gas attack. Well, in chemical warfare, the effects of mustard gas are terrible. You sort of choking up fluids from your lungs, and would blinded many soldiers, cause blisters on the skin. It was really a terrible form of warfare. And this was something which became a fact of life for many of those in the trenches. And of course, airplanes and improved explosives and tanks and machine guns. Airplanes, the 20th century would be the century in human history where death would move into the skies in terms of human-made militaristic death. And airplanes really brought that home. I mean, airplanes were I wouldn't say a small part of the battle, but they were something that people could identify with. You could see World War I aces fighting each other. There was a certain amount of rooting for them from down below. But planes were also those that dropped bombs, right? They were also those that surveilled the battlefield and were able to tell where your troop movements were. Photographs of trenches in World War I from surveillance planes was a major change in how battlefield movements could be communicated back to those controlling the movements of troops on either side. So airplanes were terribly instrumental in the war and really showed such promise that it was almost clear that to all sides that the next war would be an aerial war, that a great deal of technology would go into the aerial war. This was something that Hitler and the Nazis understood very well with the development of the Luftwaffe, which by the time of the start of the World War II was the most advanced air force on Earth. And certainly the United States understood this too. So by the end of the war, the United States would have the most advanced Air Force on Earth. Remember also, when we talk about death from above, from a sort of aerial aspect of this, that this is presaging the beginning of mass aerial bombing in World War II, which is then also presaging the development of the atomic bomb. This atomic bomb is the ultimate aerial weapon. It's the ultimate weapon that one can drop onto a city. It's the ultimate fear of the sky that defines, really, I would say, the 20th century consciousness, at least in the United States and the Soviet Union and Europe after World War II. And the airplanes, those small biplanes that are flying over Europe during World War I, are hinting, and they're dropping bombs. They're hinting at the exponentially destructive power that not only atomic bombs, which by World War II by the end of World War II can only be dropped out of a bomber, but then we go forward just to the late 1950s. These can be missile technology means these can be eventually launched from anywhere on the planet and go into near Earth space, travel around the globe, and perhaps strike a target in a matter of minutes. So all of this, if we talk about the early planes from World War I to missile technology in the 1960s, over the course of 50 years, the skies undergo a complete transformation in human consciousness. And that's a giant story for other classes and other researches, but it's a fascinating exploration. Another horror from the Great War is the maimed. Remember, with explosives, you have one of the things that's occurring as soldiers come home is those that do not come home dead. Many of them come home maimed in some way, either through exposure to chemical agents or through the loss of limbs or through shell shock. So medicine in the war becomes instrumental in trying to save soldiers' lives. Many of those lives that are saved are lives that would have of people who would have died in previous conflicts. But at the same time, what you have is it's kind of saving a sort of memory of the war in the bodies of those that come home. We talked about trench warfare and meaningless war from above. Here's an example of between February and December of 1916, over 500,000 French soldiers died in combat. So remember, the war went from 1914 to 1919, 1918. So you're talking about one 10-month period. We're looking at 500,000 French soldiers. So this doesn't count UK soldiers. This doesn't count soldiers from any other nation. That's just 500,000 French soldiers died in combat. Over the same period of time, nearly 500,000 German soldiers died during the same time period. So just between the French and the Germans, in a 10-month period in 1916, you're talking 1 million soldiers are dying. That's intense. That's an intense number. That's an almost mind-bogglingly large number of people. Young men, by the way, entire generation dies in the trenches of Europe. So let's shift to another theater, because now we're going to begin to look at some of the effects of the war in an imperial sense on these other empires. We're going to talk about what happens in Russia in a later lesson, in the next lesson. But let's talk about the last breaths of the Ottoman Empire. And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is perhaps one of the most important collapses to understanding today's geopolitics, especially in relation to the Middle East and North Africa and Europe and the United States and Russia. So it's important to see the Ottoman collapse because it occurs in the midst of World War I, but to understand how the choices that are made as it collapses by those powers that stand to benefit from its collapse in terms of control of territory, how those decisions have lasting effects to the present day. In Turkey, ultra-nationalist Turks end up taking over the government, and the empire essentially disintegrates. So now you have established really the young Turks who come over, who come to power, seize power in Turkey, which really is kind of this core of what was the former Ottoman Empire, and now after World War I, that would be the nation of Turkey, and that's a fascinating story in itself. But in the midst of this collapse, beginning in 1915, in the midst of the war occurs an event which today most historians refer to as the Armenian Genocide, which is a systematic extermination of the largely Christian Armenian minority inside Turkey, who were seen as not only outsiders, but were seen as troublesome to the survival of this emerging ultranationalist Turkish regime, and were seen as not Turks by the Turks. Over 1.5 million Armenians are murdered during this conflict. This is also the term genocide and the use of the term genocide and the coining of the term genocide is really a post-World War II phenomenon in relation to the Holocaust. But as certainly many Armenians and survivors of the 1915 genocide understood, this was not something that genocide was not something invented in World War II. Genocide was something that had taken place. Genocide meaning the planned murder of an entire race or entire people by another people or another government power. Certainly, what happened in Armenia, what happened in Turkey during this period of time fits the bill. You also have in 1916, as the empire is disintegrating, you have the Arab Revolt. The Arabian Peninsula was a large swath of it was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire disintegrates, there's the Arabs on the peninsula revolt against the Ottoman Empire and establish their own state with the help of T.E. Lawrence. If you've ever seen the great movie Lawrence of Arabia, shows obviously a totally romantic vision of this revolt, but nonetheless gives a perspective into how the British were sort of instrumental in fomenting this revolt among, or helping or aiding this revolt against the Ottoman Empire as it disintegrated. There's perhaps no more important sort of term to come out of this period of the Ottoman collapse than to understand the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Because as the Ottoman Empire is collapsing, the two dominant European powers in the region who, through the war, have been marching into the former Ottoman Empire as it collapses are going to be France and Great Britain. And both of them decide in something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which these two diplomats, these two French and British diplomats, get together and decide how are we going to administer or give some sort of order to this area. And by the area that they're referring to is the area that roughly corresponds to areas of modern-day Syria and Iraq, as you can see on this right here. Now, this is not what Iraq looks like today, and this is not what Syria looks like today. But nonetheless, under this Sykes-Picot Agreement, notice the areas that are said to fall under British rule. This area becomes under British rule, this vast area of the Ottoman Empire, stretching from the borders of Persia, today Iran, all the way to the border of Egypt and what is Gaza here, Here, north, Syria will be controlled by, or will be an Arab state under French protection. So you have, notice these different areas. You have, well, excuse me, British rule is this area, what is part of Kuwait and some of Iraq. Here, this is under direct French rule. This area that borders Turkey up here, which and this all of this corresponds to what is modern day Lebanon and sort of the coastal areas of Syria. And then these areas are Arab states which are under British protection. So really, in a sense, they are controlled by by those states. Well, the Sykes-Picot Agreement draws this line, right, which is essentially part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Here's another example of this line between A and B. A, French, B, British. This is just a line in the sand. This line corresponds to no geographic. There's no reality to it. It doesn't follow anything except for just a line. It essentially was almost drawn by a pen. This line today, after some changes in the territory, though, roughly corresponds to the modern border lines of what is Iraq. And if you've been following at all the course of Iraqi history from just the early 90s, when Iraq attempts to invade Kuwait, to the Second Gulf War, and then the rise of ISIS, you see that Iraq has been a region of general chaos, and not always chaos, but certainly it's been through a great deal of warfare, in which certainly over 1 million people have died. This state, one of the problems with Iraq is that as the lines are drawn, they're not really drawn with a clear eye towards how they're going to be practically administered. The rise of Saddam Hussein, this essentially strongman that rules from Baghdad, a Sunni leader from Baghdad, who was the Sunni powerhouse in Iraq, is from this side. I guess I'm putting success in quotes here. The success of the Iraqi state under Saddam Hussein was in the Sunnis oppressing a large Shiite minority here in the southeast area of Iraq, and also suppressing and oppressing a Kurd minority, both Christian and Muslim Kurds, in the northern part of Iraq. So this is really a state of three different sort of national and religious identities cobbled together and only held together by the strong figure of Saddam Hussein, who ruled ruthlessly and ruled as a dictator. So you have a state which, if you go back to Sykes-Picot in 1916, you see that the borders are certainly not drawn according to the ideas of national self-determination, which will govern the redrawing of Europe after the war. These are drawn for the use of France, and Britain in figuring out how best to cope with each other in the administration of the state. And the legacy of Sykes-Picot from 1916 all the way over 100 years later shows that these nation states that owe their borders to these lines, this system is causing on these borders a fair amount of discord, and a lot of the wars and conflict in the Middle East, certainly over the last 30 years, can perhaps be traced back to the not only imperfect nature of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but the lack of attention to how the region could be drawn up that would be more fair to many of the peoples who lived in the region. One thing that also occurs, now this occurs before the war, but grows in power during the war, is the idea the almost intoxicating idea among European Jews in particular that perhaps there can be a national homeland for Jews. Remember, all the way, the history of Jews in Europe is a very long and fascinating one. But certainly, since the medieval era and before, Jews who did not have a nation state, they had no nation state, they had no particular center of power. Jews were widely dispersed in cities all over Europe. Um, they were often they often were involved in industries that the Christian church in the medieval era either discouraged or would not let Christians get involved in, such as the banking system. Usury, for instance, was considered a sin um, under the tenets of the Christian church. That does not mean that Christians did not engage in it. Usury meaning the collecting of interest on debt through banking, but Jews had no such compunction about that. So Jews often took over um, those roles in many European cities. In any case, the by the beginning of the 20th century, as nation states and nationalism grew, not only in Europe but around the world, Jews themselves, who certainly felt that the land of Israel, located in what was Palestine, what is Palestine, the land of Israel was their original national home, and there grew an idea, this idea of Zionism, which is this idea of almost a repatriation or a return to create some Jewish homeland back in the land of back in the ancient land of the Middle East, back in the ancient land of what we often call the Holy Land. Theodor Herzl wrote on the Jewish state in 1896 and theorized, look, discrimination and persecution against Jews in Europe and around the world is not going to end. This is something which has occurred time and time and time again throughout history. Herzl was speaking about recent pogroms that occurred in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and that some sort of homeland was necessary to protect Jews from this constant persecution. And in many ways, this was very pressing, because certainly about 50 years after he writes on the Jewish state, you have this terrible Holocaust exacted by the Nazis. Herzl imagined this as a gradual process, in that the funds would be raised. It would start out as a charity in which funds would be raised to help Jews. Some Jews move to Palestine and begin to set up lives there and set up communities. And Zionism became a very popular in Jewish communities, a way of giving money to support the Zionist cause. And the Zionist cause was just to establish a presence down in Palestine. This what his idea did, it was electrifying for many Jews, because this offered, it seemed at the time that the idea came about, is largely impractical. I mean, how do you affect this? But he saw it as a gradual process, and his work was very convincing. And it seemed to unite for many Jews the religious aspects of their faith and the return to the religious homeland of the Jewish faith, but also these new ideas of nationalism, which are brewing all over the world, that Jews can feel some sort of political identity by uniting both their religious identity and then having a political identity that has a homeland base to it. And also the geopolitical, in that, in one sense, they could also, as Europeans, move to Palestine and be allied with their European cousins and relatives in Europe, that they could actually form a new state, a state that would bring, and this is certainly part of part of the chauvinism of the time, which was present in all European populations, but to bring some of the sort of light of European civilization down to Palestine, which was seen as sort of lacking that. And this was something which Europeans were doing all over the world. There was nothing exceptional about it to the Zionist experiment. This was an assumption that was certainly carried into Africa by all European states and carried around the world, in Asia, carried around the world. So Zionism had a measure of that expectation, even back then as well. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Balfour issues the Balfour Declaration, a fascinating letter, a very short letter, which communicates to Lord Rothschild, that says, "I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." By 1917, the British had control of Palestine, were administering it as a protectorate. And this signaled to Jews, not only in England and in Europe in general, that now that the UK government was in control of Palestine, that establishing this homeland, this dream of a national homeland for Jews, would be something that the UK government would get behind. So the strength of the British Empire, plus this opportunity afforded by the changes in control, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the change in control of this region to British protectorship or protectorate, would be enough to start this project on a practical scale, or that this project could succeed. Certainly by the time of 1917, many Jews had already moved down via the Zionist project into Palestine. But this started to give it some measure of practicality on a geopolitical and international scale. And remember, the British Empire, even still by 1917, is probably the most powerful empire on earth, now being greatly weakened by World War I, but certainly quite powerful. Now, again, we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution more when we get to the next lesson. But just as the Ottoman Empire is collapsing and all of these things are occurring, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, you're having in the East, on the Eastern Front, an absolutely almost apocalyptic happening in the war is that Russia implodes from within. Discontent in Russia in regard to military excursions outside of Russia's borders had almost caused an internal revolution in 1905, which had actually caused the establishment of the first democratic body in Russia, the Duma. That still, the Tsar was still an autocrat and still mostly in control of Russia in the midst of World War I. But in 1917, in February, first there is a rather moderate revolution which overthrows the Tsar. That government, that provisional government, rules does not, even though many in the revolutionary movements, and there was the Bolsheviks who were communists, who were, I guess you would call the most radical wing of these revolutionaries, believed that Russia should just immediately withdraw from the war altogether. This was not done as after the February Revolution, and as it went into the summer of 1917, it became clear that popular discontent at the war was rising. There did not seem to be any movement. There did not seem to be any gains. It just was continuing to suck young men out of Russia to their death. And so in October, in what is called the October Revolution, Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin seized power from the Mensheviks and seized power in really a radical revolution. For the purposes of World War One, which we'll restrict our look at here, Lenin moves to end the war immediately. Immediately withdraws Russian troops from the front. Just wholesale. Just does not surrender. Just draws them back. Uh, this this makes Britain and France livid at this kind of betrayal in the war. Now that Russia has basically withdrawn, now there is no Eastern Front. Now Germany can send, it's very tired, but send any soldiers to the Western Front, and it seems like a kind of disaster for the Allies. March 1918, in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia surrenders Ukraine, Belarus, what is today Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and all the Baltic states, essentially surrenders them to Germany and Austria-Hungary. Just leaves. What's remarkable about this is an area which included at the time of the start of the war 1/3 of the Russian population and 1/2 of Russian industrial capacity. Gives you a sense of how radical the Bolsheviks were. Also, 90% of Russian coal mines. This is in effect lopping off one of the most productive areas of the Russian Empire, essentially abandoning it to the other side in the interest of shoring up. The strategy was to shore up power in the area that could be defended without having to worry about invasion. So the long-range plan is not necessarily to always surrender those areas, but at least in Lenin's mind and in the mind of the Bolsheviks, it's to just completely end the war and end what is considered an imperialist war, totally remove themselves from it and allow it to go what it is and continue this new international communist revolution which is being dreamed about. Almost at the same time, and not coincidentally, that Russia leaves the war, Britain and France receive a new infusion of troops, which would ultimately be decisive in the end of the war. Now, the United States is certainly not a European power. The United States is thousands of miles away across an ocean. They certainly have a lot of familial and generational and ancestral ties and sort of political and ties to Europe, certainly to Great Britain, certainly to France. And at the beginning of the war, the United States stayed out. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, endeavored to stay out of the war, endeavored to try to stay neutral, to try to trade with all parties. And that means even Germany. Remember, one thing about the United States as of 1914 is that the United States has a pretty large German population. They also have a pretty large Irish population, which is none too fond of Great Britain. So sentiment as to which side the United States would support, it was always kind of understood that the United States would have more sympathies towards Great Britain, but and France and the Allied side, largely because of geographic proximity and form of government. But at the same time, that's not a foregone conclusion. In New York and many other cities, and certainly in Pennsylvania and out in the Midwest, there are a lot of Germans a lot of people of German descent who have some sympathies with Germany. So it's not clear by the beginning of the war that the U.S. is going to get involved and not stay neutral. The U.S. also believed, over a long course of experiences with European foreign powers and from also the admonitions of George Washington, the president himself, don't get involved in foreign entanglements. The United States saw itself as impregnable. It had oceans on either side, relatively weak powers to the north and south that could threaten them. So the continental United States, which had been spanned by the start of World War I into one political entity, U.S. political leaders did not see a lot of good in getting involved in the war at the beginning or taking sides. And they tried to trade with both. Well, Britain moved to block U.S. trade with Germany. Remember, Britain controlled passage through the English Channel, which is the route by which U.S. ships that were trading with Germany would have to go. So Britain moves to block them. This is not seen so aggressively by the United States. Uh, Britain justifies it by various means, but in any case, so that's the end of U.S. trade with Germany, even though on paper it said that the U.S. would trade with both. U.S. then moves closer to the Triple Entente. Remember, now they're still trading with Britain and France. They still want a market for, and they're still sending things to Britain and France. They're still sending war material to Britain and France. Well, U-boats, German submarines in the U-boat warfare, the Germans who were not really able to sail their fleets unmolested through the English Channel and out into the open ocean, it made it an open Atlantic Ocean, were mostly stymied by the British, but their development of submarines, so these hidden underwater, obviously, submarine vessels that could torpedo and come up and attack ships and shipping, became an element of fear in the war, not only for the British Navy, who could not detect them. Remember, there's no sonar at the time to figure out where these submarines are. It also became a matter of great concern for commercial shipping. And now the United States is trading mainly with Britain and France because of the closing of the English Channel by the British. And so the Germans are sending U-boats into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're instructed to basically target any ships flying Allied flags. In May 1915, the Germans sink the ocean liner, the SS Lusitania. The Lusitania is flying a British flag. It comes over to it's sailing off the coast of Ireland. It's torpedoed. The intelligence that the Germans have is that there was war material on the Lusitania, of which there was secretly, but the ship sinks. 1,200 people are killed. Remember, this is 3 years after the Titanic, in which 1,500 people die. Approximately 1,200 people are killed. Many women and children die in the sinking of the Lusitania, and 128 of them are Americans. Immediately, sentiment against the British begins to mimic the propaganda that the British had, which was that the Germans were barbaric, that they would kill women and children, that they're heartless, that they're completely ruthless, and that this begins an era of fierce anti-German sentiment in the United States, and the beginning of a ginning up of war footing by the United States. The United States realizes that it might be drawn into this war one way or another, and starts to make preparations to do so. Remember, it's not going to do so in May 1915. This is not going to be the critical event that's going to bring the United States into the war, but it's certainly setting the stage for it. By 1917, let me back up. 1916, Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president, Democratic candidate, he wins re-election. He wins election to a second term in 1916, and on his platform he says, we're not going to war, we're going to be neutral. Almost immediately after he is inaugurated in early 1917, scandal breaks out, the Zimmerman telegram. And the Zimmerman telegram is a telegram that's intercepted from German diplomats, a sort of offer to Mexico that if Mexico will fight the United States, that Germany will help Mexico regain territories that Mexico lost in the Mexican War in the South. The thought today seems a bit absurd. How would Germany really help to weaken the United States so much that they'd be able to get these large areas of what is today the American Southwest back under Mexican control? But it's seen as, rightfully, as a direct provocation against the United States. And the Zimmerman telegram becomes that kind of final straw that breaks the camel's back and increases this anti-German sentiment and sends the United States starts to commit to entering World War I. Here's a famous poster, a famous enlistment poster, a famous piece of propaganda It was designed to, I'll just read off what I wrote here, designed to provoke British men to enlist in the army, depicts a mother holding a child in her arms as she sinks to the bottom of the ocean from the Lusitania. The poster is still considered one of the most effective propaganda posters of all time, as it simply connects the sinking of the Lusitania with the war effort and the defense of the mother country. So this image of this mother and child sinking to the bottom of the cold, dark Atlantic because of the barbaric torpedoing of British ships. This is meant to have soldiers join in and join the fight to avenge this nameless mother. Well, not to cut to the chase, but the entry of the United States to World War I ends it pretty quickly. I mean, remember, the war has been going on since 1914. U.S. declares war in 1917, but it's really not until 1918 that large numbers of U.S. troops begin to show up. Remember, they have to be trained, they have to be sent over. They eventually mobilize almost 1 million U.S. soldiers. Not all of them reached Europe because the war ends so fast, but there's a huge mobilization. And in 1918, these soldiers really begin to hit the battlefield in the spring of 1918. They're called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. By this point, Germany is terribly weakened. Even with the departure of the Soviet Union in late 1917 and early 1918, morale is very low among the Germans. It's very difficult to get food to the front. It's very difficult. The winters are very difficult. So the winter of 1917 1918 would be very difficult for German troops. Younger and younger soldiers are appearing on the lines, 16, 15. And the U.S. troops that are coming over are fresh off of the farm and fresh out of the cities of the United States. They are excited for battle. They are trained. They're obviously rather green, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them with new military machinery, new guns, new uniforms, well provisioned. And this is just too much for the Germans to bear. The fresh U.S. troops break through these tired lines in a series of campaigns. We can see here May, June, September. They break through the tired lines. They split the German line, push the Germans all the way back into the middle of Belgium. See this vast line. So this trench line. Germans are pushed way back into the center of Belgium. And then in November of 1918, November 11th, the Germans sign an armistice ending the war. November 11th is today still celebrated in the United States. It's now called Veterans Day, but for a long time it was called Armistice Day. Now it has been changed to honor all veterans, but prior to that, November 11th was a national holiday to celebrate the end of World War I. This greatly increases U.S. power and prestige. I mean, the United States, this sleeping giant over the Atlantic with all of this industrial might and all of this manpower and all of these potential soldiers, bursts onto the battlefield in 1918. And it should not be, it's not American propaganda to say that this is a decisive event. This turns the entire tide of the war, breaks through the trenches, and really is effective in ending the war. And begins this long 20th century narrative, both in the American mind and in the European mind, of whoever has sort of the United States on their side is eventually going to win the war. Remember, the United States does not enter World War II when it first starts either. It does not enter World War II in 1939 when it starts. They don't enter until 1940, well, really effectively until 1942, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. But this dream of the awesome power of the U.S. military and industrial might coming to bear on one side or the other in these European wars is something which certainly becomes decisive and becomes a prize for that matter. So here we have the same map. Afterwards, certainly because of the freshness of U.S. troops, and certainly because of the decisive nature of how fast that collapse of the German lines occurred, the U.S. president comes in, remember, neutral for most of the war in the United States. Woodrow Wilson comes in with a series of very bold new ideas for how Europe should reorder itself in the wake of this terrible conflict. The smoke is clearing from the battles. The true scale of the carnage and devastation and horror is beginning to be realized. And Woodrow Wilson comes in with a philosophy of what there should be is peace without victory. That there should be no gloating about the victory. There should be no victory as in a war of the past. There should be this should be a sober reflection on the horrors of what has just been experienced and how can this be prevented again. The question that is swirling in these preparations for how to negotiate this peace is how do you affect a peace that is not a bitter peace, this peace without victory? And what do you do about reparations? Now, remember, Woodrow Wilson is leading a nation that had relatively few casualties in the war. There were many, don't get me wrong, but relatively few compared to the European powers. And Woodrow Wilson does not have as much of a stake in what goes on the European continent after the war. But he believes that there should be no reparations regime, that generally there should be no reparations paid from the losers, i.e., Germany, Austria, Hungary. There should be no monetary reparations paid between nations because this is just going to increase enmity in the future. This is just going to create a new scramble uh, in future years between those who resent the peace, etc. By the way, this is not the way that Britain and France look at it. Britain and France are pissed. You excuse my language, but they are angry. They blame Germany for the war. They blame Germany for provoking the war. They see Germany's invasion of Belgium as the invasion of a neutral country, sort of breaking the rules of war. They see them as barbaric. A lot of the propaganda at the war has certainly increased a lot of enmity at Germany, even in their loss. And so these are sort of the different sides here. There's Germany, Austria, Hungary who have been defeated. Um, you have Great Britain, France who have largely won the war, but are greatly or somewhat weakened by it. You have the United States, this power that has participated in the war and wants a say in what happens afterwards. So the United States does not have to come in again like it would in World War II and and help out. And then, of course, you have Russia to the east, who just has turned into a sort of utopian communist experiment, which nobody really knows where that's going. Well, Woodrow Wilson comes over with 14 points, and there's a lot of points. Not asking you to remember them all, but we'll go through them in this list here. I'll talk about the League of Nations in a second. One is that Wilson says one of his points is there should be open diplomacy. There cannot be secret diplomacy. When we have secret agreements between different nations, this creates suspicion. And if there are secret agreements, then nobody really knows where one stands. And then one must prepare for the worst eventuality. So there must be open diplomacy. All diplomacy should be open. There should be freedom of the seas. The seas are not owned by anyone. There should be no use of U-boats in warfare. There should be free shipping. That the zones of the zones of the seas should be able to be navigated by any power without fear of being attacked. There should be arms reduction. That all nations of Europe should seek to disarm or at least reduce to a great extent their military capacity and keep it that way through inspections and through mutual agreements. There should be movement towards free trade. There should be none of this protectionist regime. Trade wars create enemies, create military enemies. So trade wars, the protectionist regimes of these European powers, Wilson is saying, and many economists at the time believed, were creating the sort of fuel for the next war. This is one of the things that people bring up with the current trade war going on, why many people believe it's a profoundly bad thing. Because in a trade war, trade disputes often become enmeshed with military disputes. There often becomes no line between them. Free trade, the thought goes, whatever we think about the potential deleterious effects of free trade on workers, etc. The idea is that free trade increases the desire of other nations to cooperate with each other, so that nations want to make money, and in wanting to make money and wanting to increase their own economic output, you might be loath to attack someone you're trading with. And also, one of the most important is Wilson says that there should be self-determination for ethnic people. Certainly looking at Austria-Hungary and the example of Austria-Hungary, in which you had all of these nationalities that desired national self-determination, that what goes into the calculus is, what if there were a line of buffer states that represented many of these nationalities? A Poland for the Polish people, Hungary for the Hungarian people, Austria for the Austrians, Czechoslovakia for the Czechs and the Slovaks. That if there was some sort of national determination and that a series of states were created between Russia and Germany, those two powers would be less likely to fight. You would have these buffer states would be able to be peaceful because they would be expressions of the different nationalities within them. No, this is partly a utopian idea, but the idea is that a people that is able to live within their sort of nationally self-determined borders and is able to have their own government will be less likely to invade other areas with the excuse or the expectation that those who are part of their particular ethnic group can be repatriated into the larger empire. So this is the idea that not only Woodrow Wilson has, but this is one of his 14 points. Perhaps the most important 14 point would come in Article 10, which would be encapsulated in Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles, which would establish the League of Nations. In order to enforce all of these points, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, arms reduction, movement, in order to enforce them, you must have some sort of international body with teeth that can enforce these rules, meaning a council or a league of nations in which all nations would participate. And they would all meet periodically. They would iron out differences. If one nation went outside the bounds of what was considered international law, the other nations would, to a certain extent, be obligated to help bring that nation back into line. This eventually, obviously, would become what we know today as the United Nations. At the end of World War I, in the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations is formed. And the reason why the League of Nations disappears, because there is no League of Nations today, is ostensibly and ironically because the United States Senate never approves the entry of the United States into the League of Nations. There was a lot of objection in the United States towards surrendering American sovereignty to this international body, much the same way that there is this suspicion of the United Nations today. But the idea is that the United States wanted to still remain isolated and independent and unique in that sense, and did not want to participate in an international body that in any way looked as if the United States was going to have to surrender its sovereignty or be subject to the decisions of that body. Of course, the United States saw itself as a virtuous democratic republic, and so it had a lot of these ideas about its own exceptional nature, and that it did not need to participate in this body. The other nations of the world, which were obviously warring and chaotic, needed to participate in the League of Nations. The League of Nations would eventually fail, obviously, and most historians agree that had a lot to do with the lack of participation of the United States. It also have to do with lack of participation in the United States made other nations take it less seriously. Japan leaves in the 1930s, and then it's a long, slow collapse of the League of Nations by World War II. In the Treaty of Versailles, this meeting in Versailles to negotiate the end of the war, a few things happen. First of all, Germany and Russia are not even invited to the treaty signing. So you know right there that this is not going to This is not going to be the dream of a peace without victory that Woodrow Wilson has. Britain, France, and Italy, they want reparations and they want territory. They want colonies. So they're still thinking in the same mindset. They're still having the same assumptions about the pre-World War I world, about the post-World War I world that they had about the pre-World War I world. That they will have colonies, that they want money, they want to greatly weaken Germany, they want to keep Germany weak, and that they want Germany to pay up. As we know, and almost any student of history knows, this reparations legacy would create a huge amount of resentment in Germany and give rise to the enmity and give credence to the arguments of far right parties, specifically the Nazis in Germany, that Germany was getting shafted, that Germany was paying too much in reparations, that it really wasn't Germany's fault that the war started, and that other nations needed to accept some of the blame, and that Germany should not be increasingly penalized for their participation in the war. And the reparations legacy and the damage that it does to the German economy is something which many Germans resent. Who else is left out? So Germany and Russia aren't even at the treaty signing. Who else is left out of this? Well, certainly the former lands of the Ottoman Empire, which to a certain extent are gobbled up and carved up by European powers who are now, namely France and Britain, who are largely in control of large areas of it. So the Ottoman Empire collapses, and there's no notion of national self-determination for the former Ottoman Empire, at least the non-European portions of the Ottoman Empire. There is the establishment of Yugoslavia, which is this kind of large-scale state which encompasses many of the nationalities of the former Balkan states. French Indochina, I mean, the colonies around the world are really left out of this because many of them are gobbled up by the victors. You have in Indochina, most specifically in what is today the nation of Vietnam, the French had imperial control of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos beginning in about the 1880s, and it exacted a pretty brutal form of repression on the Indochinese people. Their regime was quite harsh, quite cruel, and it stoked a lot of enmity at France in Indochina. There would be a man who would go by the name of Genoc Quoc, who would who would be living in Paris at the time. He was from Vietnam, from the area, from what is today northern Vietnam. And he lived in Paris, and he was kind of a revolutionary, and he believed that the French, and he would speak at many of these meetings and talk about the atrocities of the French. And he went to Versailles and tried to deliver a piece of paper, the demands of the Annamite people. Annamites are the northern district of what is today, or was the northern sort of district of what is today Vietnam, or what it was called by the French anyway. So this demands of the Annamite people that he delivers at Versailles is meant to call attention to the world at the fact that, hey, the Indochinese should have national self-determination as well. Remember, this man would become Ho Chi Minh, that would go by the name Ho Chi Minh, and would fight against the Japanese in World War II, and would seek U.S. help in driving the French out after World War II, and this would not happen. It would give rise to French Indochina War, and then later the Vietnam War. Africa is left out. They do not have any measure of national self-determination after the war. We don't get the benefits of that either. China is similarly left in disarray. Now, China after World War I, increasingly becomes divided between a nationalist, the nationalist Chinese under the leadership of, this will be later in the 30s and 40s, the Chiang Kai-shek, and the insurgency of the communist leader Mao Zedong. So China is left in disarray and is really will be in a civil war for most of the post-World War I period into and after World War II. The 41 million dead are certainly left out. There's no return for them. 41 million. That's the estimate. It's rough. Millions, tens of millions of people die in World War I, and nothing more is ever seen from them again except the memories that people have of them. Germany's left out. And then, this is not an aside, it should be understood that many of those dead don't die of direct sort of ammunition or direct being killed in combat. Many of them die of disease. And one of the things that wars make possible is the spread of horrific diseases. The conditions in the trenches were terrible. The conditions, you're bringing together large groups of people in close quarters in terrible conditions with not a great deal of medicine. And in 1918, just as the war is ending, what many epidemiologists and historians consider one of the most disastrous disease pandemics in human history breaks out. There's some debate as to where the disease comes from. It's called colloquially in at the time the Spanish flu, because it's thought to come from Spain. And a lot of these names of flus get tied to the imagined places where they come from. Certainly when they first pop out of nowhere, they seem to pop out of nowhere. Today, many historians believe that it actually begins in the U.S., perhaps in Kansas. It ends up spreading. Notice you see here it says Spanish influenza. So that's what it's called, Spanish flu. Spreads to U.S. troops who then take it to Europe. In 15 months worldwide, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people die of the Spanish flu. This is not a normal flu. Okay, this is not a flu that is the seasonal flu that comes around every year that people get shots for. Although every flu has the potential to be a super deadly flu. The conditions of World War I make the spread of a super deadly flu much, much more likely. 50 to 100 million dead, that 3 to 5% of the global population dies in the Spanish flu. The chances are, whether you know it or not, you probably have a relative that died of the Spanish flu or the flu pandemic of 1918. 670,000 die in the United States alone. Now remember, one thing about this flu, one thing that was noticeable about it was it did not just strike old people, not strike older people and young people. It did, but it also struck those people who were in the prime of their life. This is often the marker of particularly vicious strain. Affected the young. 2% of the developed world dies. 7% of Russia and Iran die. 14% of people on the island of Fiji die. Entire villages in Alaska are completely wiped out by the flu. It's thought today that that it began in the United States, perhaps Kansas, and it began among livestock. That this could have been, I believe that it could have been an avian flu that spread among livestock, chickens kept in poor conditions, and that the flu then spread to humans, which is why we often fear both swine flu and avian flu today. So this is really the kind of terrible exclamation point at the end of the war. So the philosophical perspectives on the war is this meaninglessness, the psychological sense of alienation and meaninglessness, which I discussed before, gives rise in the 1920s to a group of writers which often calls themselves a lost generation. This is not only writers, but also thinkers and young people who emerged from the war, many of them having had some sort of experience with the war, some of them maimed, some of them bearing the scars of war, who feel that a lot of the promises of European society and civilization that were present, a lot of the assumptions, the class assumptions also, that were present before World War One in the 1920s just seem absolutely absurd. And you'll see the rise of a literature which is much blunter, much harsher, much less respectful of authority, much less much less apologetic as to the brutality which they depict. It also gives rise to the philosophy of people like Adolf Hitler and this philosophy of anger and vengeance, because certainly many in Germany feel that they were mistreated under the Treaty of Versailles, that resentment at the other side, the Allies in World War One, is palpable. Hitler and people like him, but Hitler in particular, as a charismatic leader, is able to convey or cast what happened to the Germans as a stab in the back. That the leaders in Berlin, the leaders of the war, had foisted them back from the front right before they were about to have victory. A total nonsensical idea given how the war was going by 1918. Many soldiers wanted to fight on. Adolf Hitler stoked on that belief that Germany should have kept fighting and that they were stabbed in the back by this leadership class that they then seek to overthrow in the post-war context. So this is, it's a political perspective, but it's also a philosophical perspective of the war. The war was a war that ended with bitterness and unfairness and must be avenged. The idea of national self-determination becomes a very powerful perspective to emerge from the war. The idea that with the rise in nationalism, that perhaps a perfect world could be created if all nationalities had their own form of government. There's clearly a logical problem with that how can each national people effectively have, especially if the nationality is dispersed over a large land, how can they um, all have a particular national self-determined homeland? But this is a philosophy which drives the assumptions of many scholars who believe that a fairer and more peaceful world could be created if these battles between different nationalities could be reduced by having the national aspirations of various people be respected in some way. So the idea of national self-determination is a pretty powerful philosophical perspective to emerge from the war, and it's almost like it's almost an outgrowth of nationalism itself, right? Nationalism is this often, sort of bold pride in one's own people and pride in the sort of expansion of one state, while national self-determination says, well, we're all kind of proud of our own national identity, and that we should all be able to do that, but we must also respect those who are not of our national identity. So this is in some ways utopian, but it also is a powerful organizing principle among those who envision and who want to prevent another World War One. Another perspective on the war is that there never could be a war like this again. Why would anybody want to go through this? Why would anybody want to see the tens of millions that were dead replicated? For many who experienced the war, it just was unimaginable that any of the nations that participated in the war and lost entire generations of young men, as they did, would want to go back into this conflict anytime soon or ever. So it was thought of both from a utopian perspective after the war, and to a certain extent as a practical, like, why would anybody want to do this again perspective, as the war to end all wars. This is the war that will cease war forever. That this war was so terrible that what else could occur? What else could make people want to re-engage in that. Certainly not in the lifetime of those that were alive. Well, everybody that said that was wrong, because clearly it's called the Great War. It's also called the War to End All Wars. And then by 1930s, late 1930s and 1940s, it's being called World War II. Excuse me, World War I. So it's being given a number because it's the second one. The idea is also that after this war to end all wars, a war with better technology and worse machinery afterwards will be the end of the world. That the end of the world, the end of not only civilization, but the end of humanity itself is looming somehow. Remember, there has been no atomic bomb yet. There has been no thought that one can be created. That won't come until the 1930s. You'll start to have the first inklings that people are thinking about that. But there is a foreshadowing of the end of the world in science fiction from the 1920s and 1930s. There's also this belief that, look, what mankind has wrought with the weapons that they have created just up until World War One. The imagination is that there could be more powerful ones coming down the pike, and that the next war that's fought will mean the end of civilization. One sort of fascinating way of looking at it also is that this is a war in which the machines begin to take over. And I'd say that not from a wacky kind of scientific perspective, but they take over in terms of that they become the most visible manifestation of the war. Not only do the wounded and the dead seem quite small in relation to the machinery that is used in the war, but that the coming of the machine has chewed up these generations on the battlefield. And you have what comes out of it in the 1920s and 1930s, this vision of the future as one to be owned by metal and not flesh. That this is a future that will be determined by the machine man, maybe the robot, or a cyborg. This will be a future in which, if you look at the images of soldiers with gas masks on, almost transformed into this otherworldly beast, that this could be the beginning of a new humankind. There's a dark vision of that, and then there's the vision of that we're going to see in figures like the sort of superheroes that arise in literature and in comic books in the 1920s and 1930s. You'll see this emergence of the metallic man, and you can trace the metallic man back to the Tin Man and the Wizard of Oz, but there's this image of this new humanity being encased in metal is a reflection of what seems to be coming down the pipe for humanity, because World War One confirmed to many that metal was king. Here you have a scene from a Czech play. I believe this was made in 1921, where the term robot is coined. See these metal men. It's called RUR. And this is the term. This is where the term robots is coined. Here is a scene from Metropolis. Metropolis, the famous Fritz Lang, Weimar era German science fiction film, in which is sort of almost perfect metallic woman is created by this mad scientist. You have the writings of Ernest Hemingway. It gives you a sort of if you write essays, you've probably been taught to write in English composition class at some point in your life. You've probably been taught to write like Ernest Hemingway. And what I mean by that is that you're not taught to mimic Ernest Hemingway, but that the assumptions of how Ernest Hemingway changed writing kind of woven into writing in general. Ernest Hemingway wrote in a very reportorial way. He was a reporter. He wrote very simply. He took out all of his adjectives. He wrote very bluntly and sometimes not monotonously, but very simplest possible distillation of what he meant here. They wrote in the old days that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, but in modern war there is nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places, but those that will not break it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. Farewell to Arms, 1926. Hemingway, who was in World War I as an ambulance driver, and was injured, becomes a writer in the 1920s, and becomes possibly the most famous novelist on earth in the 1930s. His works and he's a member of the Lost Generation. His works embody this sense of alienation and disillusionment with what has happened in World War I, and really define to a certain extent the disillusionment that all literature afterwards comes to be defined by. Just a chart here showing some of the numbers. You can pause this and look at it yourself, but the numbers are terrible. Just the dead. This is just the dead in the Allied powers, 5.38 million, 9.4 million in the Central powers, 41 million dead total, includes all the deaths from pandemic and disease and civilians. And just gives you a sense of, look at the missing, 5.38 million under the Allied powers, dead. POW are missing 3.984 million. Look at the totals. 22 million casualties on the Allied side, 38 million. It's almost a mind-bogglingly large number of people. What are the legacies? Austria-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire disappear. The borders are realigned along these nationalist lines in Europe and the Middle East. Watch out for this later. Remember the Cold War. We'll be talking about this. The idea of a quick war in the modern era, the idea that these new military technologies will help create quick wars. Today we have that in terms of nuclear weapons, right? The use of nuclear weapons would make it a quick war, right? 15 minutes maybe. But this illusion that one side could dominate the other through military technology in the modern era pretty much just disappears as of World War I. Nobody really believes that anymore. It's also the beginning of the era of total war, the total mobilization of civilian populations, the attack and terrorization of civilian populations, the total involvement of the entire world in a war like this. Total war is now upon humanity. And where it is going, most people, quite frankly, are pretty pessimistic about. Another legacy is the dead and those who are disillusioned by the war. This is causing disillusionment not only in a psychological sense, but it's also causing disillusionment with the governments that brought this horror about. The military planners and those who are disconnected from those who are actually fighting and losing their lives and their limbs. This disillusionment is causing political upheavals all over the world. Nowhere more so than we've seen in Russia, which becomes a Soviet Union, the first self-professed communist state on Earth in the 1917 to 1921 period. So this disillusionment is creating political upheaval, the creation of new forms of government, new forms of imagined human organization that the world has never really experienced before. Creating immense social change. Remember, you also have an entire generation of young men in Europe that is essentially missing. They're gone. And this is greatly going to affect the birth rate, greatly going to affect marriage rates, etc. Social change in communism. Gender roles change with the loss of so many men. Women rightfully demand an equal say in political decisions. Suffrage movements arise in almost every industrialized country. The United States, under the 19th Amendment, finally women win for themselves the right to vote in federal elections. This is followed later in Great Britain and elsewhere. But gender roles, because it does not seem as if this man made world, and I use man here in the gender sense, this man made world is as great as men believed it was prior to World War One. It seems now that men as a gender, to many women, have led the world into a deadly cul-de-sac of which many women feel that their political participation will help lead the world out of. That is one of the sort of hopes of female participation in politics. You also have the legacy of the breakup of Central Europe, the rise of ethnic minorities to positions of power, and perhaps most relevant, not only for American history, but certainly for European history, is the rise of the United States to a dominant global power, both economically, military, and socially. The United States after World War One will really become the ascending power, and after World War One will become the world's primary creditor nation. And the U.S. in the 1920s will absolutely boom, will become pretty much the wealthiest nation on the planet, and start to eclipse the British Empire. The British Empire is now in decline severely, and the United States is skyrocketing upward. And so the United States' power in relation to Europe would mean that the United States is going to be involved, whether the United States likes it or not, or whether it wants to admit it or not in the interwar period, is going to be profoundly involved in European politics for the rest of the 20th century. And with that, I will see you at our next lesson on the Russian Revolution.